The moment Isabelle's brother walked into that Florence apartment, everything shattered. Damien Blackwood, the man she'd been kissing just moments before, stood frozen as Marco's face drained of color. "You're sleeping with a Blackwood?" Her brother's voice cracked with fury. And that's when Damien understood. The woman he'd fallen impossibly in love with, the one who'd made him feel things he never thought possible. She knew exactly who he was from the very beginning. Their chance encounter at that Milan art gallery? Orchestrated. Every laugh, every touch, every whispered confession, part of a plan 30 years in the making. Because Damien's father didn't just bankrupt Isabelle's family. He killed them, not with his hands, but with legal documents and hostile takeovers that destroyed everything the Russos had built. Her father died of a heart attack in court. Her mother withered away in depression. And 15-year-old Isabelle made a promise over their graves. She would make a Blackwood fall in love with her, then destroy him the way they destroyed her family. But here's what she didn't plan for. She actually fell in love with him too. Now they're standing in the wreckage of their romance. And the question isn't whether love can survive deception. It's whether love built on revenge can become something real. Before we dive into this story, if you believe in second chances and the power of redemption, would you take a moment to like this video and subscribe? It truly helps us share more stories about love, forgiveness, and the courage to change. Thank you. Now, what happens next will either heal two broken families or finish what his father started 30 years ago. Milan's most exclusive art exhibition wasn't where Damien Blackwood expected his life to change forever. The Galleria d'Arte Moderna had transformed into a glittering showcase of Europe's finest sculptures, where champagne flowed as freely as the compliments exchanged between collectors who measured their wealth in billions. Damien moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his tailored Tom Ford suit fitting him like armor, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. At 35, he'd built Blackwood Industries into a global luxury real estate empire, transforming struggling properties into billion-dollar assets with a precision that had earned him both admiration and fear in equal measure. He was ruthless. He was calculating. He was utterly successful. And he'd never been in love. He didn't believe in it, actually. Love was a weakness, a distraction, something that clouded judgment and compromised negotiations. He'd watched colleagues lose fortunes over romantic entanglements, seen powerful men reduce the shadows of themselves chasing feelings he couldn't comprehend. Damien had built his empire on cold logic and unwavering focus, and that had served him perfectly well. Until he saw her. She stood across the gallery, framed by a towering marble sculpture of intertwined figures, and something in Damien's chest shifted in a way he'd never experienced. She wore a midnight blue dress that moved like water when she tilted her head to study the artwork before her. Her dark hair swept elegantly to one side, revealing a graceful neck adorned with a single strand of pearls. There was something magnetic about her, a quiet confidence that drew the eye without demanding it. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She simply was noticed. Damien found himself moving toward her before he'd made a conscious decision to do so, navigating through clusters of art enthusiasts with singular purpose. As he drew closer, he could see the intelligence in her eyes as she examined the sculpture, the slight curve of her lips suggesting she understood something about the piece that others might miss. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was depth there, layers, a complexity that intrigued him far more than mere physical attraction ever could. The artist spent 7 years on this piece, Damien said softly as he reached her side. He said he couldn't finish it until he understood the space between connection and consumption. She turned to look at him, and Damien felt the full force of her gaze. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the gallery lighting, and they studied him with an intensity that matched his own. She was older than the women who typically populated these events. He realized, mid-40s perhaps, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes that only enhanced her elegance. There was something timelessly sophisticated about her, a woman who'd earned her beauty through experience rather than youth alone. "And did he understand it?" she asked, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an Italian accent, smooth and cultured. "I'm not sure anyone truly understands the difference," Damien replied, surprising himself with the honesty. "We like to think we connect, but perhaps we're all just consuming each other in prettier ways." Her lips curved into a fuller smile, and Damien felt another unfamiliar sensation, something warm spreading through his chest. That's quite cynical for an art exhibition opening. "I'm Damien Blackwood," he said, extending his hand. "And cynicism is what happens when you spend too many years in boardrooms and not enough in beautiful places like this." She placed her hand in his, and the contact sent electricity up his arm. "Isabelle Russo," she said. "I curate a gallery in Florence. We specialize in Renaissance restoration, but I make exceptions for contemporary pieces that speak to something timeless." They talked for an hour, then two. The gallery emptied around them as conversations deepened, moving from art to philosophy to the peculiar loneliness that comes with success. Damien found himself saying things he'd never voiced before, thoughts he barely admitted to himself. And Isabelle listened, truly listened, challenging him with observations that were as sharp as they were insightful. When the gallery director finally approached to gently suggest they were closing, Damien realized he didn't want this night to end. Over the next 3 months, Damien Blackwood discovered what it meant to be consumed by another person. He, who had always prided himself on compartmentalizing every aspect of his life, found his thoughts drifting to Isabelle during board meetings, conference calls, and late-night reviews of acquisition proposals. They kept their romance intensely private, meeting in carefully chosen locations far from the prying eyes of tabloids and business associates who would dissect every detail of his personal life. Weekend trips became his new religion. Milan to Florence on Friday evenings, where he arrived at her gallery just as she was locking up, and she'd greet him with that smile that made his carefully constructed walls crumble. They walked through the lamplit streets of Florence, her hand in his, talking about everything and nothing. She taught him to see art not as investment pieces, but as conversations across centuries, showed him how a single brushstroke could contain an entire philosophy. In return, he found himself sharing the parts of himself he'd kept locked away. The loneliness of his childhood with a father who measured love in profit margins. The weight of building an empire, while wondering if any of it actually mattered. London became another sanctuary. His penthouse overlooking the Thames, where they'd spend Sunday mornings in comfortable silence, her reading catalogs from upcoming exhibitions while he worked on his laptop, both simply existing in each other's presence. It was a kind of peace Damien hadn't known existed. The businessman who slept 4 hours a night found himself staying in bed until noon, wrapped around Isabelle, listening to her breathe, feeling something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. His business associates began to notice. "You're distracted, Damien," his CFO mentioned during an acquisition review. "The Henderson deal, you normally would have closed that in 2 days. It's been 3 weeks. Damien had simply smiled and signed the papers, uncharacteristically unbothered by the delay. What was time when measured against the way Isabelle challenged every assumption he'd ever made about what mattered? She matched his intensity but redirected it, showing him that passion didn't have to be about conquest. It could be about creation, appreciation, connection. During one late-night conversation in her Florence apartment, surrounded by books on Italian Renaissance masters and the faint scent of jasmine from her balcony garden, Isabelle had asked him something no one else ever had. What would you do if money didn't matter? If the empire disappeared tomorrow, who would Damien Blackwood be? He'd been silent for a long moment, genuinely unsure of the answer. His entire identity had been built on success, on the Blackwood name, on the fortune he'd multiplied tenfold from what his father had left him. Without it, who was he? The question haunted him for days, but it also opened something in his mind. For the first time in his life, Damien found himself considering what he might sacrifice. Not just material things, but priorities, ambitions, the relentless drive that had defined him. He caught himself thinking about Florence, about what it would be like to wake up in that sun-drenched apartment every morning instead of his sterile London penthouse. About trading hostile takeovers for gallery openings, profit margins for conversations about light and shadow and meaning. Isabelle never asked him to change. That was perhaps what made him want most. She accepted his ruthless business persona, never flinched when he described particularly aggressive deals, never judged the calculating coldness that had built his fortune. But in her presence, that coldness thawed. He found himself laughing more, a genuine sound that surprised him each time. found himself caring about things beyond quarterly reports and acquisition targets. 3 months in, Damien Blackwood, who had never believed in love, had to face an undeniable truth. He was completely, vulnerably, terrifyingly in love with Isabelle Russo. And for the first time in his calculated life, he had absolutely no idea how to control what happened next. It was a Sunday morning in Florence, the kind of perfect autumn day that made the city glow golden in the early light. Damien had arrived the night before, and they'd stayed up late on Isabelle's terrace, wrapped in blankets, talking about a potential trip to Vienna for an art auction she was considering. He'd offered to take her in his private jet, and she'd laughed, calling him incorrigible, but her eyes had been warm with affection. Now, mid-morning sunlight streamed to the windows of her apartment as Damien made espresso in her small kitchen, wearing nothing but his dress pants from the night before, feeling more at home in this modest Florence flat than he ever had in any of his luxury properties. Isabelle was in the shower, and he could hear her humming softly, a sound that made him smile in a way that would have shocked anyone who'd ever sat across from him in a negotiation. He was planning to tell her he loved her. Today, the words had been building in his chest for weeks now, terrifying and inevitable, and he finally accepted that fighting them was pointless. Damien Blackwood, who had never surrendered to anything, was ready to surrender to this. The knock on the door was sharp, insistent. Damien frowned, setting down the espresso cups. Isabelle wasn't expecting anyone. He crossed the door and opened it, finding a man in his early 40s standing in the hallway, dressed casually in jeans and a jacket, holding a bag of groceries. The man's face was pleasant, smiling, until he saw Damien. Then every drop of color drained from his features. The grocery bag slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor. Oranges rolled across the hardwood. "No," the man whispered, his voice strangled. "No, tell me you're not." His eyes traveled over Damien's bare chest, the obvious intimacy of the scene, and something like rage began replacing the shock. "Tell me you are not sleeping with my sister." Damien's mind raced, trying to understand the sudden hostility. "I don't know who you think I am, but you're Damien Blackwood." It wasn't a question. The man's voice shook with barely contained fury. "I've seen your face in enough business journals. You look just like him, just like your father." The world seemed to tilt. Damien heard Isabelle's footsteps behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath. "Marco," she said softly, "please don't." "Don't." Marco's voice rose, echoing in the hallway. "You're sleeping with a Blackwood, Isabelle? After everything? After what they did to us?" Damien turned to look at Isabelle. She stood in the doorway to the bedroom, wrapped in a robe, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. Her face had gone pale, but it was a look in her eyes that stopped his heart. Not surprise, not confusion, guilt. She'd known. She'd known who he was. "Someone needs to explain what's happening," Damien said, his voice colder than he'd intended, the businessman's mask sliding into place to protect against whatever was coming. Marco laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "She didn't tell you?" "Of course she didn't. That was the plan, wasn't it, Isabelle? Make him fall first. Make him feel safe." He turned his fury on Damien. "Your father, Richard Blackwood, destroyed our family 30 years ago. Hostile takeovers, legal manipulation. He bankrupted the Russo hotel empire and took everything we had. Our flagship properties, our legacy, everything our grandfather built. And my father, he fought back, took it to court. Had a heart attack right there in the courtroom during the final hearing. Dropped dead while your father's lawyers celebrated." Damien felt like he couldn't breathe. He looked at Isabelle, waiting for her to deny it, to explain, to say something that would make this make sense. "My mother never recovered," Marco continued, relentless. "Fell into depression. Died 2 years later. We were children. Isabelle was 15. I was 12. Sophia was 10. We lost everything. Our parents, our home, our future. All because of Richard Blackwood." The silence that followed was deafening. "Isabelle," Damien said quietly, "tell me he's wrong." She met his eyes, and hers were filled with tears. But she didn't speak. Her silence was the answer. And in that moment, Damien Blackwood's world shattered completely. Damien left without another word. He dressed in mechanical silence, while Marco's accusations hung in the air like poison, while Isabelle stood frozen by the bedroom door, tears streaming down her face, but still saying nothing. Nothing that mattered. Nothing that could undo what he now knew. He walked out of the apartment, out of the building, into the Florence streets that had seemed so magical just hours before and now felt like a beautifully decorated prison. His driver, accustomed to his employer's unpredictable schedule, asked no questions when Damien appeared 2 hours early and said simply, "London." Now, the flight back was a blur. Damien sat in the leather seat of his private jet, the same one he'd offered to take her to Vienna in, and felt something cracking inside his chest. Not his heart. He'd never believed he had one of those to break. But something fundamental to who he was, some foundation he'd built his entire identity upon, was crumbling. He'd been played, seduced, manipulated by a woman who'd orchestrated everything from that first seemingly chance encounter at the Milan gallery. How long had she planned it? How many details had she crafted? The midnight blue dress, the intellectual conversation about art and philosophy, the way she'd challenge him just enough to intrigue him, but never enough to push him away. Every moment had been calculated. Every touch had been a weapon. Every whispered confession in the dark had been a lie. But that wasn't what destroyed him. What destroyed him was the realization that he'd been so arrogant, so certain of his own imperviousness to emotion, that he'd never even questioned it. He'd walked into her trap with his eyes wide open, too confident in his own invulnerability to see the danger. And worse, far worse, was the knowledge blooming in his mind about his father. Richard Blackwood had died 5 years ago, and Damien had mourned him as the titan who taught him everything about building empires. Ruthless, yes. Aggressive in business, certainly. But Damien had always told himself it was just business, that the casualties were simply the cost of success in a competitive world. He'd never asked about the human cost, never wanted to know. Now he couldn't stop thinking about it. A family destroyed. Not just financially ruined, but actually destroyed. A man dead of a heart attack in court. A woman who'd lost the will to live. 3 children orphaned. Their entire world ripped away. And for what? So Richard Blackwood could add another property to his portfolio? So the empire Damien now controlled could grow slightly larger? The London penthouse felt cold when he arrived. He poured himself a scotch, then another, but the alcohol did nothing to numb the questions tearing through his mind. Had his father known? Had he cared? And what did it say about Damien that he'd never even thought to ask, that he'd built his entire life on a fortune that might be soaked in other people's suffering? His phone buzzed. Isabelle. He stared at her name on the screen, and for a moment he wanted to answer, wanted to hear her voice, even if every word would be another lie. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because the worst part, the part that made him pour a third scotch with shaking hands, was that he still loved her. Even knowing what she'd done, even understanding that every moment had been manufactured revenge, he still felt that pull toward her, still wanted to hear her explanation, still hoped pathetically that maybe some small part had been real. His business partner called that evening. "Damien, are you all right? You sound off." Off. He almost laughed. He'd just discovered that the woman he loved had orchestrated their entire relationship to destroy him, and that his beloved father might have been a monster who drove people to their deaths. Often begin to cover it. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat. "Just tired." But he wasn't fine. And as the night deepened over London, Damien Blackwood sat alone in his empire, and for the first time in his life, wondered if any of it had been worth it. The decision came to Damien in the darkest hours of that first night, somewhere between his 4 scotch and dawn breaking over the Thames. He needed to know the truth. Not Isabelle's truth, not Marco's furious accusations, but the actual, documented truth about what his father had done. If he was going to carry the weight of the Blackwood name, if he was going to continue building on the foundation Richard had laid, he needed to know exactly what that foundation was made of. He made the first call at 6 in the morning, not caring that he was waking his lead corporate attorney. "I need forensic accountants. The best you can find. I want a complete audit of every business deal my father ever made. Every acquisition, every takeover, every property in our portfolio. I want to know how we got each one." His attorney was silent for a moment. "Damien, that's going to take months, and it's going to cost." "I don't care what it costs," Damien interrupted. "I want to know everything." The investigation began immediately. Teams of accountants and researchers descended on the Blackwood Industries archives, pulling files that hadn't been touched in decades. Damien threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once reserved for acquisitions, but now he was hunting for something very different. He was hunting for the truth about who his father really was. And what he found horrified him. The Russo case wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a strategy. His father's signature move, refined over 30 years of building his empire. Richard Blackwood had specialized in identifying family-owned businesses in financial difficulty. Then instead of offering fair buyouts, he'd used every legal manipulation available to force them into bankruptcy, tie them up in litigation they couldn't afford, spread rumors that tanked their credit, make strategic moves that choked their supply lines or drove away their customers. Then, when they were desperate and broken, he'd swoop in and acquire their assets for pennies on the dollar. The Russos had owned a chain of luxury hotels across Italy, properties that had been in their family for 3 generations. Beautiful, historic buildings that Richard had wanted to add to his portfolio. But they wouldn't sell, so he destroyed them instead. Damien read the court documents, his hands shaking, saw his father's lawyers systematically dismantling everything the Russo family had built. And there, in the final hearing transcript, he found it, the moment when Isabelle's father, Antonio Russo, had collapsed. The dry legal language couldn't hide the horror of it. Opposing counsel requests recess. Antonio Russo unresponsive. Emergency services called. Proceedings suspended. But the Russos weren't alone. Damien found 6 other families, 6 other stories of destruction. The Hendersons in Scotland, who'd lost a textile business that had employed their town for 100 years. One of the sons had committed suicide 3 months after the bankruptcy. The Chens in Singapore, whose shipping company had been their grandfather's legacy. The family had scattered across the globe, unable to stay together after losing everything. The Kowalskis in Poland, left homeless at ages ranging from 8 to 73 when Richard foreclosed on properties they'd owned outright, using legal technicalities Damien's research team could barely understand. Each file contained more than financial records. There were newspaper clippings, photographs, documented evidence of lives ruined. And in several cases, there were handwritten notes from his father, literally celebrating these victories, marking them as particularly profitable acquisitions, noting how much he'd saved by waiting for complete desperation before moving in. Damien found himself physically ill, stumbling to his bathroom to vomit as the weight of what he was reading crashed over him. His entire empire, everything he'd been so proud of, everything he'd spent his adult life building upon, was constructed on the bones of destroyed families. The luxury penthouse he sat in, the private jets, the billions in his accounts, all it was soaked in other people's suffering. And he'd never questioned it, never asked, never wanted to know. He thought of Isabelle at 15, burying her father, burying her mother, watching everything disappear. And he understood with devastating clarity why she wanted to destroy him. 6 weeks passed before Damien could bring himself to face her. 6 weeks of sleepless nights, of drowning in documents that detailed his father's cruelty, of watching his own reflection in mirrors and wondering if he was looking at a monster son or just a different kind of monster. His business partners grew concerned. He'd lost weight, stopped attending social functions, turned down deals that would have excited him months ago. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. How could it? When he now understood that every dollar he'd made was built on someone else's destruction. He flew to Florence on a gray Tuesday afternoon, arriving at Isabelle's gallery just as she was preparing to close. Through the window, he could see her moving between paintings, her elegant silhouette backlit by soft gallery lights. She looked thinner, too. He noticed, tired. When she saw him at the door, she froze, her hand pressed against her chest as if steadying her heart. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other through the glass. Then she unlocked the door. "Damien," she whispered, and the sound of his name in her voice nearly broke his resolve. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Please." She stepped aside, letting him enter the gallery. The space smelled of oil paint and aged wood, familiar scents that brought back memories of conversations that now felt like they'd happened in another lifetime. They stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by Renaissance masterpieces, neither knowing how to begin. "I know what my father did," Damien said finally. "All of it. Not just to your family, but to 6 others. I've spent the last 6 weeks reading every file, every document, every piece of evidence of his cruelty." He saw her eyes widen slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Isabelle. I don't deserve it. What my father did to you, to your family, it's unforgivable. And I've spent my entire adult life building on that foundation without ever questioning where it came from." "Damien," she started, but he held up his hand. "Let me finish. Please." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I can't change the past. I can't bring back your parents or undo what was done to you when you were 15 years old. But I can make a choice about who I want to be going forward. And I want to make this right. Not just for us, for everyone my father hurt." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase, hands shaking slightly as he opened it. "I'm establishing the Russo Memorial Foundation. $500 million, endowed in your parents' names. It will support families who've lost businesses to predatory practices, provide legal assistance, financial counseling, education funds for children who've been displaced. I'm returning properties that were wrongfully acquired, including your family's flagship hotel in Rome. I'm publicly condemning my father's legacy and committing to a complete reformation of how Blackwood Industries operates." Isabelle stared at the documents, tears beginning to stream down her face. "You can't buy forgiveness, Damien," she said, her voice breaking. "I know," he replied quietly. "I'm not trying to. I'm trying to do what's right, regardless of whether it changes anything between us. These families deserve restitution. They deserve acknowledgement of what was done to them. Your father deserves to have his legacy honored instead of buried under my father's greed." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a war raging. Pain and hope, anger and something that might have been the remnants of love. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you were right to want to destroy me," Damien said simply. "Because I was complicit in my ignorance. Because those 3 months with you, even if they were built on revenge, show me what it means to actually care about something beyond profit margins and acquisition targets. You made me want to be better than my father. And even if you hate me forever, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be exactly that." He placed the documents on a nearby table. "I'm not asking for another chance. I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for the opportunity to do what's right, even if you never want to see me again." Isabelle watched from a distance as Damien Blackwood systematically dismantled everything his father had built. It started with a press conference that sent shockwaves through the international business community. Standing before cameras and reporters, Damien publicly condemned Richard Blackwood's legacy, detailing the predatory practices that had built the family fortune and announcing his commitment to making restitution. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Business colleagues who respected the Blackwood name now called him a traitor. Partners withdrew from deals, citing concerns about his judgment and loyalty. Friends from his elite social circles stopped returning calls, unwilling to associate with someone who betrayed his own father's memory. Damien lost more than business relationships. He lost his identity within the world he'd always inhabited. But he didn't stop. Over the following months, Isabelle watched him return the Russo flagship hotel in Rome, a stunning property overlooking the Piazza Navona that had been the crown jewel of her family's empire. He didn't just transfer ownership. He funded a complete restoration, bringing the building back to the glory her grandfather had originally envisioned. The Russo Memorial Foundation launched with ceremonies honoring each family that had been destroyed. Damien attended every single one, listening to stories of loss, offering no excuses, accepting the anger and pain directed at him with quiet dignity. He tracked down descendants of the families his father had ruined and offered not just financial restitution, but public acknowledgement of what had been stolen from them. Isabelle received updates from Marco, who began cautiously monitoring Damien's actions. "He's losing millions, her brother reported during one phone call, his voice uncertain. His company's stock has dropped 30%. Major investors are pulling out. This isn't a publicity stunt, Isabelle. He's actually sacrificing everything. She wanted to dismiss it as manipulation, another calculated move in a long game she didn't understand. But as months passed, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Damien was transforming not just his business practices, but the fundamental structure of his empire. He implemented ethical review boards, refused acquisitions that would harm local communities, turned down profitable deals that relied on legal manipulation. His profit margins shrank. His business empire contracted, and he never wavered. Then came the moment that broke through Isabelle's carefully constructed walls of skepticism. Damien tracked down Enzo Martinelli, an elderly man who'd been her father's closest business partner and dearest friend. Enzo had lost everything alongside the Russos, his own small hotel chain absorbed into Richard Blackwood's empire. Now in his 80s, he lived in a modest apartment in Naples, barely scraping by on a pension. Damien spent an entire weekend with him, recording hours of conversations about Antonio Russo, about the kind of man he'd been, the vision he'd had for hospitality that honored tradition while embracing innovation, the way he'd treated employees like family, the dreams he'd had for his children's futures. From these recordings, Damien created a documentary, not about himself or his redemption, but about the people his father had destroyed. It featured Enzo's stories, photographs from the Russo family archives that Damien had somehow obtained, testimony from former employees who remembered Antonio Russo with tears in their eyes. The documentary honored her father's legacy, gave voice to his vision, showed the world who he truly was before Richard Blackwood erased him. Every penny from the documentary's distribution went to the families featured in it. Isabelle watched it alone in her Florence apartment, sobbing as she heard Enzo describe her father's laugh, saw footage of her parents dancing at a hotel opening, listened to employees recall how Antonio had paid for their children's educations and attended their weddings. Damien had given her something she thought she'd lost forever, her father's memory, restored and honored, not as a footnote in Richard Blackwood's story of conquest, but as the good man he'd actually been. When Sophia called her that night, her younger sister's voice was thick with emotion. He's not his father, Isabelle. I didn't want to believe it, but he's nothing like Richard Blackwood. Marco was slower to soften, his anger more entrenched. But even he had to admit that what Damien was doing went far beyond performance or manipulation. This was 18 months of consistent, costly, genuine transformation. The restored Russo flagship hotel in Rome was breathtaking. Damien had spared no expense in bringing it back to its original grandeur, consulting historical archives and tracking down craftsmen who understood the traditional techniques Antonio Russo had valued. The lobby gleamed with polished marble, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across frescoed ceilings, and everywhere Isabelle looked, she saw touches that honored her father's vision. This was where Marco and Sophia had finally agreed to meet Damien face to face. Isabelle stood beside him in one of the private conference rooms, her presence a statement she hadn't fully articulated even to herself. After 18 months of watching his transformation, of wrestling with her own conflicting emotions, she'd made a choice. Not forgiveness, not yet, but presence, bearing witness to whatever came next. Marco arrived first, his jaw set, his eyes hard. At 42, he carried the weight of being a man of the family at 12 years old, of raising his younger sister while grieving parents he barely got to know. Sophia came moments later, now 38, more willing to hope but visibly nervous. They sat across the table from Damien, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marco broke the silence. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" His voice shook with barely controlled rage. "I was 12 years old, standing at my father's funeral, watching my mother fall apart, knowing we were about to lose our home. 12. Sophia was 10. She cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years. Every single night. Do you know what that does to a child?" Damien didn't look away. "No," he said quietly. "I don't, and I'm not going to pretend I do." "We had birthdays without parents," Marco continued, his voice rising. "Graduations, weddings, births of our own children. Every milestone, Every moment that should have been celebrated with family, we felt their absence. Your father took that from us. He took everything. You're right, Damien said. He did. And nothing I do will ever give that back to you. Sophia leaned forward, her voice softer but no less painful. I was 10 years old, and I watched my mother stop eating, stop sleeping, stop wanting to live. I didn't understand depression then. I thought she just didn't love us enough to stay. It took me years to understand that your father broke something in her so fundamental that she couldn't find her way back. Do you understand that? Your family's wealth, your empire, it's built on my mother's grave. Damien's hands trembled slightly on the table. Isabelle could see the effort it took for him to maintain composure, to not make this about his own pain. I can't give you back your childhood, he said finally. I can't bring back your parents. Nothing I do will ever be enough, but I can spend the rest of my life trying, not because it absolves me or my father, not because it earns forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. Marco's eyes narrowed. Why? Guilt? Or because you're in love with our sister? Both. Damien answered with devastating honesty. The guilt would be there even if I'd never met Isabelle. But loving her made me see what my blindness cost, what my arrogance allowed me to ignore. She made me want to be better than my father. She made me understand that legacy isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you choose to build. He slid documents across the table. This is a proposal, not a request, not a demand. A proposal. Merge what remains of the Russo legacy with the reformed Blackwood Industries. Create something new. A company built on restoration instead of destruction, on honoring families instead of breaking them. Your father built hotels where families made memories. My father destroyed families to build his empire. I want to spend the rest of my life honoring your father's vision, not continuing mine. Sophia picked up the documents, her hands shaking slightly. Marco sat back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Our father believed that hospitality was about creating spaces where people felt valued, Sophia said quietly, where they felt safe. Your father believed in taking whatever he wanted, regardless of who it hurt. Can you understand the difference? I'm learning, Damien replied, and I want to spend my life proving that I understand it, not with words, with actions. Florence had never looked more beautiful. 2 years after that first night in Milan, the city seemed to glow with a warmth that had nothing to do with the Tuscan sun and everything to do with a small ceremony taking place in the garden of the restored Russo flagship hotel. Olive trees provided dappled shade over intimate seating arrangements, their silvery leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The scent of jasmine and lavender filled the air, mixing with the distant sound of church bells echoing across the Roman countryside. Isabelle stood in a simple cream-colored dress, elegant and timeless, her dark hair swept up with small white flowers woven through it. She looked radiant, but more than that, she looked at peace. The war that had raged in her eyes for so long had finally quieted, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. Marco waited at the entrance to the garden aisle, offering his arm to his sister. Are you sure? He asked quietly, giving her one last chance to reconsider. Isabelle looked toward the altar where Damien stood, and her eyes softened. I've never been more sure of anything, she whispered. Marco nodded slowly. I'm still working on forgiving, he admitted. I don't know if I'll ever fully get there, but I respect what he's done. And I see the way he looks at you, like you're the only thing in the world that matters. Like he'd burn down everything he's built if it meant keeping you safe. He paused, his voice catching slightly. Papa would have liked that about him. Not the burning down part, but the devotion. They walked down the aisle together. Past Sophia, who stood as maid of honor, her genuine smile a testament to how far they had all come. Past the elderly Enzo Martinelli, who wiped tears from his eyes as he watched Antonio Russo's daughter Maria Blackwood. Past representatives from the families of Memorial Foundation had helped, their presence a living reminder that healing was possible. Damien waited at the altar, and when Isabelle met his eyes, she saw them glistening with tears. This man who'd once been untouchable, invulnerable, had learned to let himself feel everything. The joy and the grief, the hope and the fear, all of it written plainly on his face. They'd chosen to write their own vows, wanting words that reflected the complicated truth of their journey. Isabelle spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I plan to destroy you," she said, and a ripple of surprise went through the guests who didn't know their full story. "I spent 30 years carrying rage and grief, planning revenge that I thought would finally give me peace. Instead, you showed me that love isn't about revenge. It's about choosing to build when it's easier to tear down. You've honored my father's memory more than I ever could through hate. You've given me back pieces of my family I thought were lost forever, and you've taught me that the bravest thing we can do is choose love, even when every reason says we shouldn't." Damien's voice was rough with emotion when he began his vows. "You taught me that real power isn't in domination. It's in restoration. I was my father's son, blind and arrogant, until you showed me I could choose to be someone different. You made me want to dismantle everything I'd built, not to win you back, but because it was the right thing to do. I choose love, Isabelle. Every day, despite the cost, despite the difficulty, I choose love. I choose you. I choose the life we're building together from the ruins of what our fathers left behind." When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the garden erupted in applause. But Isabelle barely heard it. She was lost in the moment, in the impossible truth that the man she'd meant to destroy had instead saved her from drowning in bitterness. The hotel around them bore a new name now, carved into elegant brass at the entrance: the Russo Blackwood, a symbol of reconciliation, of two families choosing to write a different ending than the one that seemed inevitable. At the reception, Enzo gave a toast that brought everyone to tears, honoring both what was lost and what had been built from the ashes. He spoke of Antonio Russo's vision, of the kind of man who believed hotels should be sanctuaries, and of how Damien had chosen to honor that vision rather than continue his father's legacy of destruction. As the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Damien and Isabelle found a quiet moment alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The reception continued below them, laughter and music floating up to the warm evening air. But up here they had solitude, a chance to simply breathe in what they'd accomplished together. Isabelle leaned against the stone balustrade, and Damien wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hand coming to rest gently on the slight curve of her belly, the secret they'd been keeping, waiting for the right moment to share. She covered his hand with hers, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Your mother would have loved this," Damien said softly. "All of it. The hotel restored, the family together, the new beginning." Isabelle felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the ones she cried for so many years. These weren't tears of grief or rage. They were tears of healing, of gratitude for having found her way through the darkness. "We're naming her Elena," she said quietly, "after my mother. I want our daughter to carry that legacy forward. Not the pain, not the bitterness, but the love my mother had before your father broke her." Damien turned her gently to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. "Our daughter will know both family stories," he promised. "The truth of what happened, the pain that was caused, and the choice we made to heal instead of continuing the cycle. She'll understand that legacy isn't just what we inherit, it's what we choose to build." Over the past 18 months, the transformation had continued far beyond what either of them had imagined possible. The Russo Blackwood Foundation now operated in 15 countries, having helped over 200 families rebuild after predatory business practices destroyed their livelihoods. The documentary Damien had created was being used in business schools around the world, challenging future leaders to consider the human cost of their decisions. Marco had joined the company as chief financial officer, his sharp mind and ethical compass ensuring that every deal met standards Antonio Russo would have been proud of. Sophia ran the hotel division, bringing her father's vision of hospitality to life in properties across Europe, creating spaces where families made memories instead of monuments to corporate greed. Isabelle's gallery had expanded, now featuring emerging artists from families the foundation had helped, giving voice to those who'd been silenced by powerful men like Richard Blackwood and Damien. The man who'd once measured success in billions and acquisitions, now measured in families reunited, in businesses restored, in cycles of generational trauma finally broken. His empire had shrunk by conventional measures. His net worth had dropped significantly. Friends from his old life no longer called. But when he looked at what he'd built with Isabelle, at the healing they'd chosen over hatred, he'd never felt richer. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabelle asked, searching his face. "Everything you gave up? The life you had before?" Damien smiled, and it transformed his features, softening the sharp edges it used to define him. "I regret who I was," he said honestly. "I regret the years I spent blind to the suffer my wealth was built on. But giving it up? Choosing this life with you? Not for a second." He kissed her forehead gently. "You know what I learned? Real power isn't in taking what you want regardless of the cost. Real power is having everything and choosing to give it away for something that actually matters." Below them, baby Elena's first birthday will be celebrated in this very hotel in a year's time. 3 families would gather, bound not by blood but by choice, by the conscious decision to forgive and rebuild, and create something beautiful from ruins. The sins of the previous generation didn't have to define the next. Revenge might have brought Isabelle to Damien, but love had healed them both. And sometimes, the most shocking thing wasn't falling in love with your enemy. It was choosing to break the cycle of hatred and discovering that from the ashes of destruction, hope could grow. Damien Blackwood had lost his empire to find his soul. Isabelle Russo had lost her revenge to find her peace. Together, they'd proven that the end of hatred begins with a choice, the choice to love even when every reason says you shouldn't. And the greatest legacy isn't what we inherit from our fathers. It's what we choose to build for our children. If this story moved you, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, not for me, but because you believe people can change. Because you believe love is stronger than revenge. Because you stand against the cynics who say the past always defines the future. Drop a comment and tell me where you stand. Type "Healing Wins" if you believe in second chances and the power of redemption. Type "Justice Matters" if you think actions have consequences but transformation is still possible. Let me know what this story meant to you. And if you know someone carrying old wounds, someone choosing between revenge and forgiveness, someone who needs to see that breaking the cycle is actually possible, share this story with them. Sometimes we need to be reminded that healing is a choice we can make, even after decades of pain. The Blackwoods and Russos found their way from hate to hope. They chose restoration over destruction. They chose love over legacy. What cycle will you choose to break in your own life? This community stands for believing in the best of people, even when they've shown us their worst. Are you in? More stories of redemption, transformation, and the courage to choose love are coming soon. Thank you for being here.